Hello, can anyone hear me?
Yep, you are on.
All right.
All
Hi,
right, everyone, welcome to our Sobering Nature Tours virtual program series here. We're excited to be offering another one tonight. We've been having some great programs and lots of great interaction from our participants. And tonight we're really excited to have my co-owner, Brian Zwiebel, presenting on waterfowl photography. He's got some of the best waterfowl photography I've ever seen, and we're excited to hear tonight how he gets these shots and how you can have a chance to get some of these shots as well. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brian for our program tonight.
Thank you much, Rob. Give me just a second to get the screen share going. Thanks everybody for tuning in tonight, much appreciated. We're going to start off, and I'm just going to start and say there are no secrets out there in any aspect of nature photography, really. Sharing these baby raccoons that appear to be telling each other secrets, but I'm not going to keep any secrets from you. We're going to start off with the Canada goose. Not everybody's prime target for photography, but it is waterfowl, and in good light. They can be quite beautiful as long as you get on the light angle and get a nice background for them. And they're great practice subjects. A lot of geese flying around different locations, even town parks and such like that. So if you can capture them in good light, you can still make some beautiful images of the family group. And of course, the babies are super cute. These are actually taken out of the car window, not my normal waterfowl photography mode. But everybody loves baby geese and the little leg stretch. But we're going to get into the waterfowl now, and we're going to do a series of wood ducks. And this is just to show that there's really no limit you're never done with photography of any bird. There's just so much going on, so many different things to do. Verticals with reflections, calling, more calling and beautiful fall color water, showing some habitat, perfectly lit, showing off all the iridescence. Got to get the close-ups to show off all those details. And don't forget the ladies, they're beautiful too. Beautiful henwood duck. And of course, the action shots. You got to get the flapping, some preening here on the nest box. Wood ducks like to sit in trees, so we want to capture some of that. And of course, the flight shots, the real action shots that are super hard to get of these wood ducks flying through the forest. But anyway, we're going to talk about that and much more. The first thing we really need to look at is that camera manual. When you get that new camera, do break the cellophane off that manual and have a look at it. I know most cameras now you have to get online and download that PDF. But I can't tell you over the years how many times somebody's come to me with a camera question. I asked to see their manual, and I had to remove the cellophane off of it to be able to look up the answer for them. In the manual, you'll learn about histograms, and we're going to talk about those here for a moment. And the histogram up here in the left is just showing a graphic representation of the tonalities of all the pixels in your image here. And it's going to start on the left at 0, which is detailless black. And you see there's a little spike there. That's some blacks without detail in here somewhere. Maybe even on the tip of the bill that's smooth and glossy. But the darkest stuff's going to be on the left. It's going to make a peak. And it's going to be some of these dark shadows here on the shoulder, the back, maybe the back of the head here. Then you've got this kind of long, low peak, which is slightly brighter tones than the deepest blacks. You're going to be looking at this part of the neck, the lit face, some of the flanks here getting towards mid-tone. But the bulk of the pixels are lighter than mid-tone. That's going to be your background vegetation, the cattails, getting brighter into the brighter areas of the water. And then the highest, brightest peak are probably these little reflections here that are showing as bright lines. We're going to look at some of these, some histograms here, just so you can kind of see, get a feel for them. This is a common eider, really high contrast species. The light's got to be good. You got to get the exposure just right. We haven't lost much detail. There's a spike here on the far right. That's actually these bright reflections of the water droplets. So I'm not worried about that. You got a little bit of a peak on the left in the blacks, certainly the shadow under the tail. But there's detail all throughout the blacks, and you've got the dark water is comprising a lot of this detail, or a lot of this information that is left of mid-tone. Every color has a mid-tone, so you can have a very bright, vibrant, like a cyan blue that's going to be way to the right, or these deep dark blues in the water way to the left. But you hear people talk about mid-tone gray, and I just want to clear up any confusion there. It's not just a black and white and gray thing. It's also in the colors. So we can kind of imagine that what this histogram might look like. Super bright water, lots of specular highlights from the spray, backlighting. Really, the only real dark area of the subject is going to be this peak right here on the left of the histogram. Almost everything else is going to be pushed pretty far to the right. And we'll look at this black scoter, super dark water, jet black bird, a small orange knob. And you can kind of visualize that almost all of the data is going to be left of the center on that graph. And we're going to look at how that shows up here. Here's that big peak, and that's all the blacks, very dark blues. Hardly anything to the right. And this is just telling me there's not enough pixels here in the orange knob to really even register on here. So we could make a bufflehead image, make the histogram look a lot like this black scoter, but that's wildly underexposed. We've lost detail in the black, under the chin, on the back. And one thing to be aware of, if we're looking at that histogram or the flashing highlights setting on our playback, this highlight right here where the water is reflecting, there's no point in trying to save detail in that. When you try to do that, this is what you end up with, a super dark image, when in reality, most of the pixels, most of the data should be well right of the midpoint here on the histogram with this bubblehead. Just a couple of dark peaks for the purple and blue iridescence and the black. So when I'm doing duck photography, I'm using manual exposure mode almost always, and especially so when I'm doing ducks in flight. The issue becomes if you're using an auto mode and you're tracking this duck against the sky as it's coming in here, then it's dropping below and you're getting a distant wooded hillside and then some really dark water. You're going to go from probably being a little underexposed up above to being overexposed as the bird drops against that darker background. And that is because the auto modes are just reading the scene and trying to average it to a mid-tone. Auto mode would have worked perfectly for this frame only, but as the bird dropped low against the dark water, it's going to try to make that dark water mid-tone, and then your brights on the duck are going to blow out. And this is a lesser scope. Perfect example is this bufflehead. If I was in an auto mode exposing properly against a light sky, I might be shooting at +2/3. And as soon as that bird drops below the horizon and you get dark water in the background, suddenly you might need to be at -1 to save your highlights. In manual mode, you're just going to expose for the subject, and it really doesn't matter what happens with the background. I've got my camera set to switch to spot metering when I'm in manual mode. And that way I can pick what I want to meter very specifically. I can either set my mid-tone or meter against the sky. In this light sky situation, I might go +2 against the bright sky in spot meter mode over a mid-tone exposure. And that's going to keep my lighter tones in the cattails, the sky, and the bird much brighter. Here you've got a situation with super bright water. And again, the camera's probably going to lean towards some underexposure for you in this situation, especially Canon shooters. The Nikon meter is a little more accurate in that regard. It's important to get that exposure almost perfect. There's just not a lot of latitude on most of the drakes. They're generally high contrast with lots of blacks, lots of whites. So I'm going to meter that gold water and make it a third or two-thirds over a midtone, and I'm going to set that exposure and take a test shot and verify that my highlights aren't blown out there. Let's talk a little bit about composition. The rule of thirds are shown here in this tic-tac-toe board, and basically those rules say that your subject should fall on one of these intersection points. So I've got the green-winged teal is sitting right here on that lower left point, but also use the other lines as a guide. So we've got some lines here that follow this lower third line. We've got a line up here that follows the upper third, and importantly, generally some space out in front of the subject for it to move into the frame with its direction of travel. Lots of horizontal lines here. You don't need the graph to show those with the bird on the lower left intersection point. Lots of space around that gad wall. I've had a little difficulty with this shot. It's a wonderful shot of a green-winged teal in flight, but there's this horizontal line right here that's kind of cutting the frame in two. I want to leave space below for the bird to be dropping in to the water. So that this is just a little too much tension for me. It's a fine shot. It's just not my favorite due to that line where the water meets the far shoreline. Similar with this shoveler, the line's a little lower, and I've got the bird pretty high up in the frame. That gives it plenty of room to drop down into the water. Still don't love that line being so close to the center of the frame. But I don't have a ton of shovelers in flight, so I'm kind of willing to live with that one. With your typical portrait, again, the bird in this case is bigger in the frame, so it's a little harder to put it on that PowerPoint. So I'm just more concerned about leaving a little space in front of the subject over here to the right. Same with this harlequin duck, getting to its eye level. Giving it some space to look into the frame. Here's the tic-tac-toe grid and a vertical. This blue-winged teal was super close and decided to flap, and I knew I was going to be cutting pieces and parts off with the edge of the frame, but I liked the way where the eye fell in this composition. Turned out pretty nice. Usually we try to avoid centering the subject, but the more vertical the orientation is, the better that seems to work by pushing it a little towards the center of the frame. The bird is looking a little left, so I left the space over there, cut off the rear end of the bird. Same with this brant. You can go in close and get more detail and shoot what's referred to as a front end vertical of the subject. But ducks with shorter necks than the goose. The front end vertical doesn't work so well because you end up with a lot of out of balance space above the subject if you're trying to make it a true vertical. So oftentimes I'm going to switch towards going more of a square crop in these situations. Just fills out the frame a little bit better. If in doubt, if I'm not loving the way a horizontal or vertical's looking, I'm going to try that square out then. Usually I try to go with horizontal or vertical, but the squares work well. This long-tailed duck's got a short neck. Wanted to see the close-up detail of the water on top of the head and the bill serrations. So this more square look worked out for me there. Typically, I talk about the head angle being really important, and you want the face to be turning back towards the camera a little bit. I did intentionally shoot this one looking away, only because the texture on the back of the head really didn't show with the head turned completely towards the camera. So I wanted to capture that. Also of note, I knew the depth of field in this situation, very close to the duck, was going to be super shallow. And therefore, if I focused here, the bill is going to be way out of focus. If I focus on the eye, probably the tip of the bill and the back of the head are going to be out of focus. So I took multiple frames. I focused on the back of the head and again on the bill, and actually merged those together in Photoshop to get the depth of field I needed without stopping the lens way down. More on composition, you can see the lines that we talked about, the upper and lower horizontal line. And you'll notice I have the subject quite far forward in the frame here, just opposite of what I just told you. And the reason being is I wanted to get this wonderful trail of splashes where the duck landed and skied in. This is a pair of bufflehead with the hen in the background. Two subjects are difficult a lot of times, but if you have them both facing the same direction, usually works best if it's the same species. Great that it's two drakes. I think a hen in the background would have worked just as well. Since they're both facing the same direction, they kind of balance each other out. It works really well. Here's another situation where we're breaking the rules, and the rules are good to know. And it's good to know, I guess, if you're going to break those rules, be able to articulate why you're breaking them. Here, the duck's way forward in the frame, and it's simply because I love this little arc of water in the splash here. More tic-tac-toe boards. The long-tailed ducks and pintail and other birds such as pheasants and stuff can be really tough compositionally because it's going to push that bird so far forward in the frame if that tail is extended out flat. Got lucky here. The bird looked back over its shoulder and the wind blew and made this wonderful arc. So a really nice composition there, and notice the eye being real close to that power point. You need some other interesting compositions with the lines and the curves. This is full of curves with the swan's neck. I got another curve here, the curve on the breast, got the arc of the wing. I do like lines to exit the frame in the corner, so that worked out well here. And a lot of times, when the action's happening like this, you're just shooting and trying to get it in the frame, and the composition will come later in how we decide to crop the image. Color can be part of the composition. This hooded merganser was in some beautiful reflections of fall color, and the tones did work well with the flank of the body here. If the colors are too outrageous and don't really match the bird, it can be problematic, but I think that worked out well here, with color being part of the composition. You can get patterns in your compositions when you have multiple birds. Most of the surf scoters are on the program looking the correct direction. You got one guy not paying attention here. He's looking the wrong way. Sorry about that. And then I love capturing action and behavior. And typically what we're going to do is go for a fast shutter speed. Again, as I'm going through here, think about those, things we've already talked about. Think about the histogram and what does that look like, and think about the composition, and in your mind, put the tic-tac-toe board up here and see if it works. Probably could have moved this duck, the spectacled eider, a little further back in the frame as far as that goes. But you're going to need a fast shutter speed to capture flying ducks, flapping ducks. This is 1/2000th of a second. Still has some wing motion blur, and I'm okay with that. This black scoter flapping at point blank range. The shutter speed is 1/1600th of a second, and there's just a little bit of motion blur going on here in the face. It just wasn't quite fast enough of a movement that was happening during that flap. So 1/2000th, 1/2500th of a second would have been a better choice. This was actually a fairly slow shutter speed. It was a dark morning. I'm shooting at 1/640th of a second. And you get this wonderful splash, but there is some blurring in the splash simply from that slower shutter speed. But I do love the blur and the wingtips on this one, this northern shoveler blasting off. Got pretty fortunate on this one. For one, I had a 2x teleconverter on the 500mm lens, so I'm shooting at 1000 millimeters and only 1/500th of a second, but did capture the face sharp, and that's the most important piece. And then wonderful wing blurs and splashes going on throughout the image due to that slower shutter speed. A little slower than probably I should have been at, but it worked out. So I do love the low angle when I'm photographing, especially shorebirds and waterfowl. Waders do not work well when the tops of them are below the water. Pro tip right there. But when you get super low like that, you can just get this wonderful duck eye perspective of the waterfowl and the other birds that you're photographing. This king eider was taken after 1 a.m. In Barrow, Alaska. Ice water spilling into the tops of the waders. You know, the flight's in 5 hours. Good times. And I love the super beautiful light that you get late up at in the Arctic, but also super early in the morning, late afternoon at more lower latitudes. This is a ringneck duck, not taken from a super low perspective. What you end up getting is just a duck on the water. A lot of emphasis on the ripples on the water. Not my favorite look. But I wanted to show that and contrast it against a lower angle view where the ripples are going to blur out a little bit more, more of an eye level view of the ringneck duck. And preferably, I wouldn't be shooting out into a large portion of open water. I much prefer to work with ducks in close quarters where they're feeding in smaller openings, so I can include some color from the background vegetation. And makes a much more interesting image, in my opinion. And this one's taken from a little bit higher perspective, but because the background vegetation is close, it does allow that vegetation to get included, even though I'm not super low to the water. Objectionable to me in the composition is just this dark line that happens to be intersecting with the bird's head. Nothing I could really do about it at this point, but things to think about. So capturing all the waterfowl portraits, lots of fun, but I much rather capture action and behavior. Waterfowl do a number of interesting things. Feeding is one of them. This is a pair of gadwall. This is pretty old school. It's a slide scan. It was taken with a manual focus 500mm lens. A pair of gadwall tip feeding. A little bit more modern image here, a shoveler doing its thing, tip feeding. But the divers are the most interesting. And you can spend a lot of time trying to capture the shot of a redhead right before that eye goes under. You literally have to shoot as soon as you see it starting to compress its feathers. They have such fast trigger reflexes. You got to shoot before they even start the dive. There's a hen common merganser, has a small catfish, and she chomped that thing for quite a while, trying to soften the spines on the fins, I presume. And here's some other common mergansers fighting over a huge gizzard shad. And you wonder what in the world are they going to try to do with this thing? It's almost as big as the duck itself. Note the serrated edges on the bill. And this bird actually pops up with the shad, takes off flapping, running with it. We need super fast shutter speeds to catch this kind of action. Things were happening that I wasn't even seeing until looking at the image after the fact. So 1/2000th, 1/2500th of a second. But here is one of the mergansers gulping down a huge gizzard shad. Here's a female doing the same from the front. Interestingly, the lower mandible has this flexible ability. It's real thin and narrow, but when they're gulping and opening their mouths up like that, it's got a flexible tip and it can open up pretty dramatically. You can see the bulk and the extra weight that this merganser's taken on here in the chest, and the tail's still sticking up out of its throat. As much as I photographed ducks over the years, this is a relatively recent image from last winter. Happened to capture a long-tailed duck surfacing from a dive. The duck's actually still underwater. Autofocus was able to track it due to the high contrast of the white head and shoulders and the black wings and chest. Camera did a nice job tracking that autofocus. This isn't going to work from a low angle, so I was actually up on a pier shooting down. I also enjoy very much photographing breeding behaviors. A lot of times you'll see breeding groups of waterfowl exhibiting displays, and very often there'll be just one female, one hen, being chased by many males. And you see the hen gadwall here in the center being chased by eight drakes. This was not even the full flock. There were additional drakes chasing around. So they say, hey girl, they're trying to attract her for mating. And she's trying to decide which one is most suitable. Here the black scoters are doing the same thing. Love catching that single hen with all the drakes that are courting. This long-tailed duck is exhibiting a head throw display, and you'll see this in migration in the spring, even before they reach the breeding grounds, even kind of late winter before they start heading to the north. See birds starting to exhibit different displays. The ruddy duck does a fantastic display where he slaps his chest with his bill and creates these little bubbles in the water. Cool little call to go along with it. The mergansers do a number of different head throws, kicks to make splashes, all part of their breeding regiment. And the canvasback also does a very elaborate head throw. Now all this is happening very quickly, so you want to time your shot to catch the peak of that display. And the bufflehead do a display where the males will fly over top of the females repeatedly in the spring. And the question begs, how am I getting this super sharp shot showing even the veins in the feet, in the pink feet of the Drake bufflehead? And it's repetition. When you see a bird doing that display, you can start to predict where it's going to fly. You can be ready and capture this action with the fast shutter speed, kind of knowing where it's going to go before it actually does it. Why in the world do I have a picture of a ring-billed gull in my waterfowl program? Well, it's all about practice, and we talked about practicing on the geese earlier. Gulls are a fantastic subject to practice tracking in-flight photography. And I want to stress, when you are photographing your ducks or whatever in flight, don't just try to focus on the bird as a whole. Really try to get that active autofocus sensor right on the face of the subject, and it's incredibly hard to do. It takes a ton of practice, and I'm not shy. I'll photograph ring-billed gulls and herring gulls and Bonapartes, whatever, just to keep in tune with acquiring focus, pre-focusing on the correct distance before raising the lens, and then trying to track that autofocus through. I may never even download the card if I'm messing around with ring-billed gulls in bad light. It's just the repetition of raising the lens, finding the bird, and shooting. Same with herring gulls. I mean, heck, gulls can be fun, so why not? Another way to practice your waterfowl photography is to find a local park where ducks are tame, maybe the kids are feeding them. You can get close, you can use a little shorter lens, and then make some pretty good images of mallards, but it just helps you with that acquiring, tracking, locking the focus, getting the shot. As I said, geese can be a good subject. You never know what you're going to find. If you're unsure if you have a cackling goose in that flock of Canadas, they are wildly smaller. So if you're questioning whether or not it is, it's probably not. Huge size difference. But I'm practicing on all these less glamorous subjects like geese and mallards and gulls, so that when I am at an excellent destination, you know, I'm going to be ready to capture that stunning in-flight shot. Here's a long-tailed duck coming right up the lens barrel. Stellar's eider in flight up at barrow. King eider. Now is not, you know, when after I've traveled 20 hours to get above the Arctic Circle, that's not the time to be worrying about, you know, getting good at flight photography. We should do that before we head to those great destinations. Barnegat Jetty is fantastic for harlequin ducks. And it gets a little more difficult. The more birds are in the frame, it's good to have the spacing between individuals. The more ducks that are in the frame, sooner or later you're going to start getting a little overlap. But try to have the you know, pick the part of the flock where the spacing is good. Eventually you're going to get a little bit of overlap, but at least they're filling out the frame here, the canvas back. And then you've got a kind of tighter knot of birds here, but fairly evenly spaced here with the common eiders. Do like how that turned out. These long-tailed ducks were in a courtship flight, and the hen's going super fast, but the males are even faster. They've got longer more pointed wings, and the drakes will catch up towards the female, and at the last second, the female will go into a very steep climb. And she'll actually outclimb the long-tailed ducks, the drake longtails. I think those wider, shorter wings probably a bit more powerful in the vertical climb than the long, skinny wings. Then the dive will start and the chase will be back on again. Just super fast ducks flying, you know, with the wings pointed up and down. This probably would have been a favorite of mine, but for the fact that you've got a wing covering the face of that drake. This is the same pair, just speeding around the tundra. So I mentioned before the practicing when you're out there in the field trying to track these birds. Select a point on the ground or a tree, something off in the distance that's roughly the same distance as the bird. Because if you're not focused close, your depth of field so shallow that you may raise your lens and you may be pointed right at the duck, but you won't even be able to see it because you're not focused close enough to the distance of where the duck is. So we've got multiple axes that we have to get in line to be able to find these ducks, the horizontal and the vertical. But also we need to have the focus distance set pretty well in order to lock focus as quickly as possible. So wind and light play a huge role in my decision-making process when I'm going to go out and try to photograph ducks, especially the flight shots. Waterfowl almost always take off into the wind. And on this particular evening, I had a west wind, beautiful light. Redhead landed in front of me, but I could tell he was nervous from the get-go. He never really settled down, and he just turned and ran straight at me, flew right over my head. Could hear the wind from the wings, but I anticipated, I knew it was going to happen because of the wind direction. I knew exactly where it was going to go. A beautiful morning light, great day to be out photographing ducks, but for one thing, the wind was from the west. So I've got east sunshine and west winds, and this is what you're going to get: butt shots of ducks coming in for a landing. Just generally does not work out very well. Not so bad on an overcast day. You can kind of set up, 90 degrees to the wind and get some nice shots. But the best lighting is when the sun and the wind are coming from the same direction, as in with this shoveler here. And they'll come in slower if they're coming into the wind. It makes it a little easier to get on them and stay on them. Just works out much better. In this instance, I had a 30-mile-an-hour west wind in the afternoon, and this green-winged teal was flapping like crazy and actually going nowhere. So it made it quite easy to get on the bird and capture a head-on shot, which would be virtually impossible without the headwind with this species. They fly so fast. Divers also going to take off into the wind. You can anticipate, they start bobbing their head, they're probably going to take off running. And in this case, the composition, I wanted to include those splashes behind the duck. So the duck's way far forward in the frame here, but I think it was the right call, getting the duck big enough in the frame and also including those splashes. This long-tailed duck, big wind coming over my back, just knew it was going to take off. Just makes it super easy to, or easier anyway, to capture these action shots, knowing what the duck's going to do before it actually does it. So widgeon landed in front of me, was a little nervous, had the wind over my back with the morning light, and was able to capture him right at the blast off moment. And same with this blue-winged teal. If the wind and the light aren't correct, a lot of times I'll just decide not even to go out. But in this case, I had the wind coming from the left, a nervous green-winged teal, and just waited for the launch. This widgeon actually had a habit of feeding on the lawn, and some skim ice developed. So instead of just swimming up to the shore and climbing out to the lawn, he would swim up to the ice and then fly the last 20 feet or so, which made it very easy to catch him as he popped up into the air. Not going real fast. Love that head-on look here. Again, 1/2000th of a second or more to capture that flight shot. I should mention, you see some vertical flight shots from me. They're almost always photographed in the horizontal format and then cropped to vertical later. Just never really find myself trying to actually track ducks with the camera turned vertically. Scadwall is just kind of hanging in the air, pretty easy to shoot when you've got the wind in your favor. Diver ducks are not quite as dependent on the wind direction for landing as they are taking off. So this redhead, canvasback, and some of the others will come in at breakneck speeds off the wind angle, and pretty much just crash into the water sometimes. They will also glide in, but if they're going the wrong direction, they're not going to swing around like a mallard and glide in. They'll hit the deck, whatever direction the wind's going. Swans have these huge feet. They come in and ski, which can make for some interesting images. And a lot of the puddle ducks will behave the same way. Most of the divers do not land that way. This longtail looks like it's going to come in and probably drop its feet and ski, but they do not do that. They actually throw their chest forward and skip like a stone across the water to come to a stop. When you watch birds long enough, you get to know these things and can figure out the best way to approach photographing it. Surf scoters, much like the longtails, they look like they're going to ski in for a stop. At the last second, they throw their wings up in the air and drop square down on their hind ends. Kind of an interesting strategy, probably due to the choppy water of the oceans where they spend their winters. And common eiders, I've seen them come in and literally just lose total control and cartwheel. Anytime a bird's coming in for a landing, I keep the shutter down because you never know. This guy caught his wing in the water and did a flip. This was a case where I knew the wind direction. I knew the bird was getting ready to blast off, and what we have here is 10 consecutive frames of an American widgeon blasting off, shot at 10 frames per second. So all of this was captured in 1 second. And if you think about it, I don't think there's anything in this world that I can do 10 times in 1 second. I can't blink that fast. I can't snap my fingers that fast. But it's amazing that this duck's going to be able to do a full up and down wing beat 10 times in 1 second. Pretty amazing birds. So where do we go to photograph waterfowl? Pretty much anywhere that you can find concentrations of ducks is going to be probably a good place to try to get that done. This was taken along Lake Erie in early spring, huge staging area for waterfowl. Midwinter, if you've got a flowing stream, you can get a big concentration of ducks, especially the hardy mallards. They're going to be the ones that stay the furthest north. As far as puddle duck goes, some of the canvasback and some of the divers will stay pretty far north as long as they can find open water as well. This canvasback was taken in a small opening in a marsh right at first thaw. I actually broke through the ice, got pretty wet prior to getting this shot. Note to self and everybody else, just kind of heed, if you're going to be working around water, chances are you're going to get your gear wet sooner or later. It's a good idea to have it insured, carry it in dry bags. Mistakes will be made and you will be punished if you're careless. This is a canvasback, also in an early spring opening. This one was actually taken out the door of a van, a small pond next to the road. It was a captive audience. Some of the streams into the Great Lakes are going to create some openings right at the river mouth, so you get some early season migrants as early as mid to late February when that opening starts to form. And it's a good place to get shots of ducks. They're flying around, everything's frozen, they're going to go to that open water. Excuse the magenta cast on this one. This canvasback is actually flying into a wastewater treatment pond in the middle of winter that was open. There's a little spring-fed pond in northwest Ohio called Castalia Pond, not too far from Sandusky. It stays open all winter. You'll get some great opportunities at widgeon, black ducks, mallards, shovelers especially. It's a great little spot. The Tetons, some of the areas around Jackson, Wyoming have some spring-fed ponds, and the trumpeter swans will take advantage of that, and a few other species as well. Common goldeneye and also Barrow's goldeneye will take advantage of these ponds that don't freeze in the winter. So there's the Barrow's goldeneye. It's one of the species I really wanted to photograph when I went out to Jackson, and it worked out well because I had open access to open water. There's a river in Cambridge, Maryland called the Chop Tank, and it's a tidal estuary river, has some brackish salt water. It will freeze up a little bit, but usually not for long. And the ducks just pile in there in the winter. It's a great place to photograph widgeon, and especially lesser scaup, canvasback, mallard, and occasionally you'll get a redhead in there with the group. So go where the ducks are and you're going to have the best chance for photographing them. This is the lesser scaup from the Chop Tank, and the canvasback from the same area. Fantastic place to spend a weekend in the wintertime. These brant were taken over at Barnegat Light, Barnegat Jetty. You get the inflow from the ocean. The tides are running through there, and you get a lot of long-tailed ducks, a number of scoters, surf scoter, also the black scoters you saw earlier were from there. I actually hired a hunting guide to take me out and set decoys on the open water to photograph the black scoter here. And you know it's cold when the inlet at Barnegat is starting to get slushy with ice. Super cold trip that year. Common eiders can be photographed there at Barnegat as well. They're more reliable up in Massachusetts. Great place to photograph them in the winter up near Boston. Here's Brian Small making a pretty expensive, costly mistake. He's got his photo vest on, but the vest isn't tucked into his waders. He's stalking some Stellar's eiders there and probably got a little too excited. But that's probably a teleconverter, maybe a telephone, maybe a cell phone in there, getting a little wet. So if you're going to work around the water, tuck your pockets inside the waders. And if you do, and you can sneak up on a king eider and get a shot like this, you'll be thrilled. The spectacled eider, also from Barrow, working from in the pond, with the ducks swimming around us. Just fantastic times. Little spectacled portraits here. And Stellar's eider. So the North Slope of Alaska is the best place to photograph those three species of eiders: the kings, spectacled, and Stellar's. And a close-up of the Stellar's reveals something interesting. We think of eye spots being on butterflies, and I haven't been able to find any research on this, but I think these dark spots are a form of eye spot like we see on butterflies and moths. When the bird's face is in the water, this spot is sticking straight up. This spot's above the water. When it tips to feed, this shoulder spot stays above the water as well. Very interesting to see that. But probably my favorite type of waterfowl photography is getting out in the marsh early in the spring. Here you see skim ice still all over the marsh. I've got a bag of decoys. It's still dark out. I'm going to set those decoys and get well hidden to try to capture some images. The best part about getting out that early is you can use super slow shutter speeds and get this beautiful blue purple light well before sunrise. I think this one was taken at like 1/30th or 1/40th of a second. So it takes a super steady hand to capture that. And I get my gear out into the marsh, oftentimes by floating it on a fisherman's float tube. It's a little safer that way. If I stumble and fall, I just let go of the tube and everything stays dry except for me. Here's my friend Bill and his float tube covered up, ready for action. The strategy is really to try to get close to a muskrat hut or something else that you can try to blend into a little bit. And capture images of what are really some super wary species out there in the marsh. In the fall, they're getting shot at. In the spring, they're not quite as jumpy, but it's good to get out there, cover up with the blind. I'm placing decoys, like I said, setting up on the light angle. And it's important when setting decoys not to set them, right in your line of sight. So I like to make a sort of a V in front of my shooting location. So the point of the V is close to me, but I leave a little gap in it. And then I usually have a couple of strings widening out to kind of make a landing spot in front of me. This Pintail's taking a nice drink of water. And blue-winged teal in close. Most of the puddle ducks get pretty nervous of the decoys pretty quickly. So if they land, get your portraits quick, they're going to probably take off. But I've had a number of divers come in, land with the decoys, fall asleep, bump into the decoys, wake up, and go back to sleep. They can be pretty oblivious. This gadwall's doing a little bit of a call. They kind of sound like their name. They make a bit of a gad type of call. One thing I'll critique on this image is the head angle is slightly off. I always like that face turned a little bit towards me. I've taken to calling it the hangle for short, but always look for that head angle where the eye's making a little bit more contact with the lens. It's more pleasing to the viewer after the fact, I think. Here's a ringneck duck with a good hangle. In this situation, I did not put out any decoys at all. I've been watching this spot. The birds were utilizing it. They were coming in every morning. I just got out there in the dark super early, got covered up, and waited for them to show up. There's several ringneck ducks were coming in there, and also some wood ducks. And wood ducks are super shy to decoy, so I definitely didn't want to do anything to spook them off. The wood duck came out, beautiful light, nice background. I was thrilled with that shot. But the decoys, they're not the best looking things in the world, but the ducks seem to be attracted to them. This looks like a one-legged duck, but actually this ringneck is lifting its legs so as not to hit the decoy with it as it's coming in for a landing. And as I said, the divers, especially canvasback, they come in 100 miles an hour with their hair on fire sometimes. Really tough to catch up to them and keep them in focus. Gotta have that pre-focus distance set where you need it, and pick them up and get your shots quick, because they're going to be past you in about a second. Here I've got a pair of redhead coming in. Depth of field's really shallow with the telephotos, so chances of getting them both in sharp focus pretty slim. Here's a hen. I should mention on the decoy setting, if you are interested in that type of photography, I would go online and do a Google search of decoy spread. You'll find lots of photos and videos of hunters telling you how to set decoys. Just remember to leave yourself a landing spot and not to put any decoys in the way where they're going to be blocking your line of sight. We did talk earlier about the low perspective for waterfowl, and the one thing with flight photography, you can't get super low, because as soon as your lens is down at water level, if you try to tip it upwards towards the sky, it gets really difficult to get your eye to the viewfinder without filling your waders with water and getting your lens wet and everything else. Nice redhead coming into the decoys on a good light angle. Another redhead here. I do love the background, so I didn't put any shots of ducks against the sky in this program. Just not near as pleasing as when they get a little bit closer and lower to the water. Just love the varying layers and color that you get with those lower shots. The mallard is actually one of the most difficult ducks to get out in the marsh to get the flight shots of. They're super wary. I was thrilled to finally get this one. I do not have a bunch of mallard shots to share unless they're taken at little duck ponds and parks and stuff. Out in the wild, they're pretty jumpy. And I just want to share with you some additional flight shots that I've taken over the last couple of years from the marsh. I'm working a lot in the Northwest Ohio, Lake Erie marshes, Sandusky Bay marshes, places like Mallard Club, Metzger, Willow Point, Pickerel Creek, some of the best places for me to go to do this type of photography. People do ask, well, how do you know you're allowed to do that? If it's a wildlife area and it's open to hunting in the fall, unless it's signed otherwise, you're good to go. At least all the places I go to in Ohio. Places like McGee Marsh, they do have hunting, but it's a controlled hunt where it's a lottery system, and you're only allowed in there for hunting. You're not allowed in those marshes at McGee or Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge without special permission. So do keep that in mind when you're thinking about access. Love the pintail, one of my favorite ducks to photograph. They show some beautiful colors, some oranges and greens in the wings. Sometimes you get some purple in the head. Things you don't see unless the light's super nice. There's a hen pintail speeding in for a landing. Another hen, different wing position. And I'll leave you with this American widgeon that was, I had all kinds of ducks coming in this particular day. Most of the shots that I just shared, the pintail were taken where I opened up a hole in the ice. Most of the marsh was frozen. There were ducks around, and we had a freeze overnight. I went out super early, broke up pieces of ice, shoved hunks of ice under the ice shelf, put out a few decoys, and once the eagles started flying around and putting the ducks in the air, they really wanted to get down into the opening that I had made. So it worked out super well. And with that, I will ask if there are any questions.
So Brian, we had one to start with. What kind of camera gear do you use to get such sharp images of the mergs and wood ducks? And also, do you calibrate your lenses?
So I use Canon gear, 500 millimeter f4. I'm currently using the 1DX camera body. Usually that lens has the 1.4 teleconverter attached to it when I'm doing portraits. If I set up correctly with the decoys, I probably am not using the 1.4 for the flight shots. I'll just go ahead and set the decoys in a little closer. Not having that converter on allows the autofocus to work more quickly and accurately, and also keeps me from cutting pieces and parts off of wings and feet and heads and stuff when the birds are in tight like that. The main reason for the super great resolution, though, the sharpness, the clarity, is just because I'm getting close to the subject. I see a lot of folks, standing on the road at Metzger trying to take pictures of ducks that are, 200 feet out in the marsh, and the cameras don't have the resolution to accomplish what you're seeing here. You really have to get either in the marsh with them or right adjacent to it, and hope to draw them in closer with the decoys, etc. It's you just can't crop as much as most people are doing. This type of image could be made with any number of lens combinations. 100 to 400 on a 7D Mark II. Your 640 millimeters effective focal length, that's plenty. You don't have to have the 500 f4. Sony has some options with their mirrorless cameras. So don't feel like you have to have the latest, greatest, best gear to get this done. I've been doing this type of photography since I was using a 20D in 2005, 8 megapixel camera. So it's more about the work and effort you put in than the gear.
And do you calibrate your lenses?
Oh,
Right.
sorry, forgot that piece. Yeah, I do. And what I really haven't had to calibrate any of the short lenses. They've been fine. You know, the depth of field is greater with those lenses, in my opinion. But when you're shooting, especially songbirds with a 500 with a 1.4, you know, your depth of field at 15 to 20 feet from the subject is paper thin. So you really do have to have that micro adjustment set correctly, especially for that type of photography. But I've seen lenses be, you know, multiple inches out of whack, and when they're that far off, they have to go back to the manufacturer for calibration. Good question.
Thanks. Oh yeah. Thanks, Brian. And one more question is, um, would you rather suggest a prime lens, or would you rather suggest a telephoto lens? Like I have a Sigma 60 to 600. I did rent the Canon 600 millimeter also, and when I was at Cornering Dam, right, I was able to get a few shots, good shots of them actually. But I felt the need to use a telephoto lens. Why? Because the birds, they were sometimes coming close on top of me actually. So what would you suggest? A telephoto is better or a prime is better?
I've had really great luck with my primes. There are times I've been on trips with folks that have, you know, like the Nikon 200 to 500 zoom, and I see images that they got that I was, you know, I was hogtied with 500 millimeters on. I couldn't take the shot. So I like the flexibility of the zoom. Unfortunately, most of those Tamron and Sigma zoom lenses, 100 to 500 or 600, they're just not super sharp at either end of that focal range. So if you're looking at a 150 to 600 millimeter lens, it's probably best to shoot that between 2 and 500 millimeters. And then they're slower, so they're f5.6 lenses, and that becomes problematic when adding a teleconverter. So I'm in love with my prime lens. I'm not ready to give it up.
Thanks, Brian.
Sure thing.
All right. Do we have any other questions this evening? You can either unmute and ask them or put them in the chat and I will ask Brian.
So a question was sent to me privately. So Brian, they're asking, how do you approach your ISO settings in order to get high shutter speed? And do you try to stay under a specific limit?
With today's cameras, let me preface this a little bit. I shoot manual mode for the waterfowl almost exclusively, but almost every other type of bird photography I'm shooting in shutter priority mode. And when I'm doing that, I'm basically using auto ISO. I'm setting the shutter speed that I want. The lens then usually opens up all the way. And then I'm willing to let that ISO go up pretty high because of the tools with the software, being able to clean up that noise. And then also just the cameras, you know, being a lot better with noise levels to begin with. So I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit of noise to get to the shutter speed that I want. But, you know, for this type of shot, we can actually go in and let's see what the settings were on this one. Oh, this box isn't. Can I move this box? I can. So this is with the 500 millimeter with a 1.4 converter. Shot actually at f8, not wide open at 5.6, but at f8, 1/2000th of a second at ISO 400. So if I have good light, I'm going to try to get up around 1/2000th of a second, even faster. And I'm not afraid to push the ISO to 800, 1600. In good light, I'm not going to go above that. In more dim light, if I need the speed, you know, I'll go to 6400 ISO. I've taken images at 12,800. As long as you don't have to crop a lot, you know, the noise is pretty doable. But if your image is, you know, the size of 10% of the center of the frame, and you're throwing away 80% of your pixels, then your noise is going to be a mess at those higher ISOs.
All right, so I've got a few questions here, Brian. The first one is, where do you set your autofocus? Single point or cross?
So typically with birds on the water, I'm just going to use a single point, or maybe the center plus surrounding points. The issue is the lens wants to, or the camera wants to grab with the autofocus the closest thing in the frame. So if I've got all the points selected, the camera's going to front focus on the water almost every time. So I really want to concentrate on the face. If that means a single point, great. If the bird's a little closer and filling up the frame a little bit more, I can do you know, the center plus surrounding 8 points. If you're doing just raptors against the sky, you can go ahead and use all the points and not worry about it too much. But refocus to the distance where the ducks are kind of coming into the sweet spot, so that when you raise the lens and get on the bird, it's already mostly in focus for you.
Awesome. Mark would like to know what software you're using for editing.
I am using a program called Breeze Browser. Well, a program that's packaged with Breeze Browser for downloading the images originally. And then Breeze Browser allows me to scroll through the images really quickly, select just the ones I want to keep, and then basically delete the non-selected images. I can go through you know, whole days of shooting you know, over 1,000 images in short order and delete out really, you know, 80–90% of the shots right off the top, whether the focus wasn't good, the composition was bad, you know, the exposure was off, whatever, not sharp, etc. From there, I'm opening the raw file in Photoshop using Camera Raw to convert the raw file, and Photoshop for anything else.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Joe would like to know, how do you approach getting closer to ducks that prefer deep water, for example, scoters or long-tailed ducks?
So most of the deep water ducks, like the long-tails, scoters, most of those were taken at Barnegat, where you're up on a rock jetty, and if you're slightly insane and very careful, you can kind of slide down the side of that jetty a little bit. Chances are you're going to get splashed with salt water, so keep that in mind. But you've got deep water, you know, right in front of you there. Some of the shots, some of the black scoter I mentioned was taken out in a boat with decoys laid out in front of us. Trying to think of some other deep water situations. Yeah, usually just clamoring around riprap and trying to find a spot where I can get low on the light angle.
I've been out there on Barnegat with you. It's a little more than slightly insane, but the photography is just unbelievable when you get set.
For sure.
I have another one of, I'm a beginning photographer and loved the photo of the duck taking off at 10 frames per second. Was that created in Photoshop?
Yes, it was. Actually, 9 out of 10 of those frames were super sharp. One of them was just ever so slightly off. And what I did is I opened the very first image with the water and everything. I expanded the canvas above and to the right quite a bit. I did a lot of painting to create you know, additional water, additional space to the right and above. And what I did then is I tried to match each successive frame with one point that was in the background on both of them, and use that as kind of my starting source point for the image that I was going to clone in. I didn't do any selections of ducks and drag them over or anything like that. It was all done just by cloning the image from one frame onto the first frame, and so on and so forth, 9 additional times.
Turned out to be a super cool image.
And Brian, I forgot to
a
ask
lot of
this at one point.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. For denoising, what software do you use mostly?
So I'm doing a denoise in the raw conversion, generally with camera raw. If it needs additional, I may apply another pass in Photoshop itself. I do have Topaz denoise. I haven't had it really long, and I'm not super comfortable with it yet, so I just haven't used that Topaz denoise too much yet.
Oh, thanks, Brian.
Sure.
And Brian, do you shoot in New Jersey or where do you shoot?
So yeah, Barnegat Jetty is in New Jersey. It's kind of at that bend in the state where the land is as far east as you can get. So that's Barnegat. It's wonderful for bufflehead, red-breasted mergansers, the scoters, some common eiders, but especially harlequin and long-tailed ducks.
And what season would you suggest? Like what months?
Pretty much you can start down there in December, maybe even earlier than that. And I've gone as late as March. The year that I went, I had a hunting guide take me out. He was booked with hunters and stuff, and the hunting season ends late February. So we went in mid-March that year. Still a ton of ducks around. But my understanding is pretty much November and all the way through March and even beyond. There's some ducks there.
I stay in New Jersey, so I'll definitely try it out this weekend. Yes.
Yeah, be very, very careful. Those rocks on the jetty are super slippery, especially if they're wet on top from a high tide or rain.
Okay.
They can get icy. Please take a friend with you. I'll share a story. A gentleman fell out there and got stuck upside down between 2 boulders. And the tide was coming up, and I think he had broke his arm. He could not get himself dislodged, but he was far enough down. He would have drowned if someone hadn't found him. So definitely a place to take a friend.
I will make a note of that. Thanks, Brian, for the pre-warning.
Yeah, think about maybe even ice cleats on your boots as well. There's a thin algae on top of those rocks, and when they are damp, it's worse than ice.
Okay.
Be careful, my friend.
Yeah, sure, Brian, I'll do that. And is there any other location in New Jersey would you suggest, or that's the only good place?
There's one of the national wildlife refuges I see some folks get some good shots out of. And I'm having a little trouble thinking of the name of that one. But there's the
Forsyth. Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge.
Forsyth. Thank you. But also down in Cambridge, Maryland, look for a street called Oakley Street, where Oakley Street dead ends into the Choptank River is a wonderful place for those lesser scaup and canvasback.
Thank you very, very much, Brian. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Someone asked if you ever shot at Montezuma in upstate New York.
I have not. What is special about Montezuma?
That's a national wildlife refuge, if I remember correctly.
Is
If I
that where
may,
all the snow geese congregate?
Brian, if I may intervene, actually, I did shoot at Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, and it does, harbor sandhill cranes. It does exhibit a huge variety of wildlife, including, what is this owl called? A short-eared owl. And it's also a very good place for snow geese like that. It's overall through the year, it's really good, actually. It's a good spot for all kinds of ducks and raptors and warblers also. They do a muck race in September, and people do end up getting 200 species or 300 species on that day.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, it's definitely someplace I've heard of and heard of good birding there. All right, do we have any other questions before we're getting a little over on time? Are there any questions before we wrap up? Brian, any parting comments?
Just in regards to Montezuma, just know that the National Wildlife Refuges are usually pretty strict on access as far as getting into the impoundments. You're better off at state-run wildlife hunting type areas, unless you reach out and speak with the staff first and get permission.
All right, well, thanks, Brian, for a fantastic program this evening. This is our last program of 2020. We'll be having a couple more programs starting back up in January. So keep a lookout for those, and we would love to have you joining in on those. I know that Jamie is going to be presenting on a recent photography trip to Costa Rica, and I will be doing a program with our guides from Ecuador early in 2020 as well. So keep a lookout for those. And we'd love to have you joining us for those. Brian, thank you again so much for this presentation. Fantastic waterfowl images and great information. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We look forward to having you back for any of our other presentations and hope to see you on tour as the COVID situation settles.
Thanks, everyone.